By the time Karen started shouting from the curb, the music in my garage was still low enough for people to talk without raising their voices. That was what made the whole thing so ridiculous. This was not some wild street party. No one was blocking traffic. No one was fighting. No one was tearing up the neighborhood. It was a simple gathering. Food on folding tables. A few coolers. Old friends laughing near the workbench. The garage door opened just enough to let the evening air in. Then Karen marched across the driveway like she had been waiting all week for a reason to perform. She pointed at the speakers, then at the parked cars, then at me. She said the HOA was done being patient. She said I was disturbing the peace. She said if I did not shut it down immediately, she would call the cops and have every person here removed. I looked past her at the street. Half the neighborhood was already watching. So I told her to make the call. She smiled when she did it. That part one remember clearly. Because 10 minutes later, when the squad cars pulled up and the officers stepped out, the look on her face changed so fast it almost made the whole night worth it. My name is Luke Mercer, and the reason I did not panic when Karen threatened to call the police had everything to do with who was already standing inside my garage. From the street, the party probably looked simple. A few pickup trucks parked along the curb. Folding chairs set up near the tool bench. A cooler full of drinks. Old music playing low through a speaker on the shelf. Nothing fancy. Nothing loud enough to shake windows. Just a group of men talking, laughing, and eating barbecue off paper plates while the sun dropped behind the houses. But this was not some random neighborhood hangout. That garage was full of people I had known for years. Some were active officers. Some were retired. Some were detectives who had seen worse things before breakfast than Karen had seen in her entire life. One was a lieutenant I had worked with years earlier. Another had trained half the younger officers in the precinct. A couple of them were in plain clothes. A couple had come straight from shift and still carried that tired, quiet posture that never really leaves law enforcement, even when they are off duty and holding a burger in one hand. That was why the whole thing felt almost surreal when Karen started making threats from the curb. She thought she was about to weaponize the one thing that would make everyone nervous. A badge. A patrol car. A police presence. She had no idea she was standing 10 feet from a garage full of men who wore those things for a living. The party mattered too. This was not just drinks and small talk. It was a retirement night for an old friend who had finally stepped away after more years in uniform than most people could handle. He was inside near the back wall, smiling in that tired way men smile when they are finally letting themselves believe the hard part is over. That was why nobody wanted drama. Nobody wanted shouting. Nobody wanted some HOA scene turning the night into a circus. But Karen did not know that. Or maybe worse, she did not care. To her, all she saw was an open garage, a few parked cars, and a chance to remind the neighborhood that her voice still carried weight. She was the kind of woman who confused public confidence with legal authority. If enough people were watching, she thought she had already won. And standing there in my driveway with half the block peeking through curtains and garage openings, Karen clearly believed this was going to become one more story about how she shut something down. She was right about one part. It was going to become a story. Just not the one she thought. Karen's real name was Melissa Hart, but nobody on the street called her that when she was not around. To most people, she was just Karen. Not because of one haircut or one complaint. Because she had built that reputation slowly, the way people like her always do. One argument at a time. One warning at a time. One loud little performance after another until the whole neighborhood knew exactly what kind of woman came marching over whenever somebody else looked too comfortable on their own property. She lived 3 houses down from me and treated the block like a stage she had been appointed to manage. If a trailer sat in a driveway too long, she noticed. If kids played basketball after dinner, she noticed. If somebody had family over and the cars lined the curb a little tighter than she liked, she definitely noticed. Then she would come outside with that same expression she always wore. Tight smile. Straight shoulders. Voice already loaded with fake patience. The kind that says, "I'm about to sound polite while trying to make you feel small." That was how she started with me the first time. A year earlier, she complained that my garage door stayed open too often on weekends. She said it made the street look cluttered. I asked her what rule covered a homeowner using his own garage. She did not answer. She just said the HOA expected better standards. After that, every little thing became a problem in her eyes. A tailgate after a football game. Friends helping me move equipment. Music low enough that you could still hear birds over it. None of it really bothered her the way she claimed. What bothered her was that I never folded the moment she started talking. So when she walked up that night and saw a garage full of men, coolers, barbecue trays, and parked trucks, she did not see a retirement gathering. She saw a chance. She pointed at the garage like she was identifying evidence and said I had crossed the line this time. She said multiple residents had already complained. She said the noise, the crowd, and the vehicles were disrupting the neighborhood. Then she looked past me at the men inside and added that she would not let the street turn into some kind of cop bar after hours. That line changed the air instantly. Not because anyone got loud. Because she had just insulted a room full of men she did not recognize. And the worst part for her was simple. Almost every one of them recognized exactly what she was trying to do. Karen's real name was Melissa Hart, but nobody on the street called her that when she was not around. To most people, she was just Karen. Not because of one haircut or one complaint. Because she had built that reputation slowly, the way people like her always do. One argument at a time. One warning at a time. One loud little performance after another until the whole neighborhood knew exactly what kind of woman came marching over whenever somebody else looked too comfortable on their own property. She lived 3 houses down from me and treated the block like a stage she had been appointed to manage. If a trailer sat in a driveway too long, she noticed. If kids played basketball after dinner, she noticed. If somebody had family over and the cars lined the curb a little tighter than she liked, she definitely noticed. Then she would come outside with that same expression she always wore. Tight smile. Straight shoulders. Voice already loaded with fake patience. The kind that says, "I'm about to sound polite while trying to make you feel small." That was how she started with me the first time. A year earlier, she complained that my garage door stayed open too often on weekends. She said it made the street look cluttered. I asked her what rule covered a homeowner using his own garage. She did not answer. She just said the HOA expected better standards. After that, every little thing became a problem in her eyes. A tailgate after a football game. Friends helping me move equipment. Music low enough that you could still hear birds over it. None of it really bothered her the way she claimed. What bothered her was that I never folded the moment she started talking. So when she walked up that night and saw a garage full of men, coolers, barbecue trays, and parked trucks, she did not see a retirement gathering. She saw a chance. She pointed at the garage like she was identifying evidence and said I had crossed the line this time. She said multiple residents had already complained. She said the noise, the crowd, and the vehicles were disrupting the neighborhood. Then she looked past me at the men inside and added that she would not let the street turn into some kind of cop bar after hours. That line changed the air instantly. Not because anyone got loud. Because she had just insulted a room full of men she did not recognize. And the worst part for her was simple. Almost every one of them recognized exactly what she was trying to do. I stepped out far enough to keep her voice from carrying straight into the garage, but not far enough to make it look like I was backing down. Melissa noticed that too. People like her always notice positioning. Distance. Audience. Who is standing where? She had done this enough times to know that control starts before the first real sentence. If she could plant herself at the mouth of my driveway and make me answer from the inside, then everyone watching from porches and half-open garages would read the picture the way she wanted them to. Her outside. Me inside. Her calling the neighborhood to order. Me being corrected in public. So I stayed right on the line. She said the HOA had been more than patient with me. She said this was not just a small gathering anymore. She said people were trying to enjoy a quiet evening and did not appreciate their street turning into a hangout for officers who should know better. I asked her which rule I was breaking. That was when her face changed. Only slightly, but enough. Because that question always bothered her more than argument did. Argument she could turn into attitude. Questions were harder. Questions forced her to either produce something real or reveal that she was running on tone and momentum. She said the board had authority to address nuisances before they escalated. I asked what part of my garage, my driveway, or the legally parked cars on the curb had escalated into a nuisance. She did not answer directly. She said there were too many people. There were not. She said the music was too loud. It was not. She said the gathering had become disruptive. It had not. Every answer she gave was built the same way. Broad words first. No detail underneath. She was not describing a real problem. She was building a mood and hoping the audience would fill the rest in for her. Behind me, the men in the garage had gone quiet enough that I could hear the ice shifting in a cooler when someone moved a bottle. Nobody interrupted. Nobody walked over. That restraint probably saved Melissa from humiliating herself even faster, but she was too busy enjoying the scene to understand how dangerous that silence really was. She told me this was my last chance to shut it down voluntarily. I looked past her at the neighbors watching from the edge of their driveways. Some curious. Some awkward. Some already starting to sense that she had come out too hot for a party that did not look illegal, chaotic, or even especially loud. Then I looked back at her and said the same thing I always said when Melissa tried to turn confidence into law. Show me the rule. That was the moment she reached for her phone. Melissa saw that flicker too, even if she did not understand it. For the first time all evening, her eyes moved past me and into the garage, not with annoyance, but with caution. Just a quick sweep. The folding chairs. The coolers. The paper plates. The men standing around the workbench and tool chest, quiet now. Watching the driveway with the kind of stillness that only made sense if they were waiting for something very different than what she thought was coming. That was the problem with people like Melissa. They are good at reading weakness. They are terrible at reading calm. She thought silence meant fear. She thought the men inside had gone quiet because the word police had landed like a threat. She had no idea that half the garage had simply gone still because they already knew exactly how ridiculous the next 10 minutes were about to become. I stepped back toward the open garage and picked up my drink from the workbench. Not because I was dismissing her. Because there was nothing else to do. The music stayed low. The food stayed out. Nobody started hiding bottles or moving cars or turning into the kind of scene Melissa had tried to sell over the phone. One of the retired officers near the grill asked if he should shut the speaker off completely. I told him no. Another man leaned against the freezer with his arms folded and shook his head once, like he could already see the story ending before the headlights even hit the curb. That was when Melissa made her second mistake. She stayed. She could have gone back across the street and waited on her porch like a normal person. She could have let the officers arrive, ask questions, and discover on their own that the party was quiet, the street was clear. And nothing about the scene matched the tone she used on the dispatcher. Instead, she planted herself at the edge of my driveway like she wanted front row seating for my embarrassment. Because that was still what she believed was coming. A public correction. A shutdown. The kind of moment she could tell the neighborhood about later with just enough exaggeration to make herself sound responsible and me sound reckless. Inside the garage, the men were handling it better than I expected. Nobody got loud. Nobody started making jokes at her expense. Nobody tried to walk outside and speed up the reveal just because they could. That restraint mattered. It kept the scene clean. Normal. Which only made Melissa's performance look worse the longer it stood there on its own. Then, from the far end of the street, I heard the first set of tires turn onto our block. The first patrol car rolled into view slow enough to make the whole street hold its breath. Then a second one turned in behind it. That was when Melissa's posture changed again. Not with fear. Not yet. With satisfaction. You could see it in the way she straightened her shoulders and stepped half a pace farther into the driveway. Like she wanted the officer's first sightline to frame the scene exactly the way she had built it over the phone. Loud party. Defiant homeowner. Neighborhood under stress. Police arriving to restore order. The garage behind me stayed quiet. No scrambling. No panic. No one suddenly hiding drinks or cutting the lights. Just men standing where they were, talking low, waiting. From the outside, it probably looked strange. Too calm for the story Melissa had sold. Too orderly for the kind of disturbance that justifies 2 patrol cars. But once people commit to a version of events, they stop seeing warning signs that do not fit it. Melissa definitely did. The officers stepped out and started walking up the drive. One looked toward the open garage first. The other took in the parked cars, the clear curb, the lack of shouting, the total absence of anything that looked remotely urgent. Even from where I stood, I could see the first question forming on both their faces. What exactly did we get called out for? Melissa moved fast before they could answer it themselves. She stepped toward them with her phone still in her hand and launched straight into her practiced voice. She said she had reported a disruptive gathering. She said the homeowner had refused every request to quiet things down. She said there was drinking, possible safety concerns, and a growing issue with off-duty officers using the neighborhood like a private clubhouse. That last line landed differently than she meant it to. One of the officers slowed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Then he looked past her into the garage again. And inside that garage, a man near the workbench lifted his hand in a casual little wave. The officer's face changed before Melissa even noticed. Not confusion. Recognition. And the second that happened, the whole balance of the night shifted so hard I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because she was still talking, still building her complaint, still trying to hand the officers a story they had already started recognizing as a mistake. The officer on the left stopped walking altogether. He looked past Melissa, into the garage, and his whole expression shifted in a way she could not see yet because she was still facing him with that same tight, triumphant smile. The other officer followed his line of sight a second later, and then the exact same thing happened to him. Recognition. Not of me. Of the men behind me. A sergeant standing near the cooler gave them a small nod. One of the retired detectives by the tool bench lifted his paper plate and said, "Evening, boys," like this was the most ordinary thing in the world. A lieutenant I knew from years back stepped half a pace forward, not to interfere, just enough to make his face impossible to miss in the garage light. Melissa kept talking anyway. She was deep into her own version of the night by then. She said the gathering had gotten out of hand. She said the neighborhood had been patient. She said she felt unsafe. But every sentence was landing weaker than the one before it, because the officers were no longer really listening to her. They were counting faces. And every face they recognized made the call sound more ridiculous. The officer on the right finally looked at me and asked, carefully, "Luke, what's going on here?" That was the first moment Melissa realized something had gone wrong. Not because anyone raised their voice. Because he had used my name. She turned and looked into the garage properly for the first time. Really looked. Not at the chairs or the coolers or the open door. At the men. One after another. The retired captain near the back wall. The detective she had probably seen in uniform at community events. The patrol guys in plain clothes. The lieutenant by the freezer. Men who were not disorderly. Not dangerous. Not some random crowd using my property as a lawless bar. They were the precinct. Or close enough. The garage had gone so quiet by then that you could hear the ice settle in the cooler beside the workbench. Melissa tried to recover fast. She said she did not know who the guests were. She said that was not the point. She said noise rules applied to everyone. But even she could hear how weak it sounded now. Because if the complaint had really been about danger, the officers would have stepped into danger. Instead, they had stepped into a retirement party full of people they worked with, trained under, or had known for years. One of the men inside finally laughed. Not loud. Just once. And that single sound did more damage to Melissa's authority than anything else that had happened all night. The laugh broke the tension just enough for the truth to take over. Not loudly. Not in some big, dramatic wave. But once that sound came out of the garage, the whole scene stopped pretending to be a police response and started feeling like what it really was. An awkward interruption. A bad call. A woman standing in a driveway realizing she had summoned law enforcement to a party full of law enforcement. One of the officers looked past Melissa and said, "Wait, is tonight for Harris?" From inside the garage, the retired lieutenant lifted his drink and said, "Retirement party. 28 years. You just missed the good barbecue." That was it. That one exchange finished what Melissa's complaint had started destroying. Because now there was no room left for her version of the night. No dangerous crowd. No escalating disturbance. No out-of-control garage party terrorizing the block. Just a calm gathering, a respected guest of honor, and a neighborhood Karen who had called in a fake crisis on people the responding officers already knew by name. Melissa tried one more time. She said the issue was still the noise and that she had every right to report a disturbance when she believed the street was being disrupted. But the words were losing structure now. The confidence was bleeding out of them. The officers had already seen the parked cars sitting cleanly along the curb. They had already heard the low music. They had already stepped into a driveway where nobody was shouting, stumbling, fighting, or doing anything remotely close to what Melissa had implied over the phone. One of the detectives inside the garage finally stepped forward enough to be seen clearly and said, "If this is your version of a public safety issue, I'd hate to see what you call an actual problem." Nobody answered him. Not because the line was especially cruel. Because it was true. And truth, once it lands in front of witnesses, does not need much help. Melissa looked from one officer to the next, then back into the garage, and I could see the exact second she understood the part that mattered most. This was not just embarrassing because she had overreacted. It was embarrassing because the people she tried to weaponize were now the audience. The very badge she thought would help her shut the night down had turned into a row of familiar faces quietly measuring how far she had exaggerated to get them here. Melissa's face changed in layers. First confusion. Then offense. Then the slow, painful understanding that she was no longer the person controlling the scene. She had expected the officers to arrive, hear her version first, and do what uniforms usually do to people who look unprepared in public. Ask sharp questions. Take her side of the tension seriously. Make me explain myself in front of everyone. Maybe even tell me to wrap it up and quiet down just so the street could go back to normal. Instead, the street had gone normal the second they stepped out of their cars and recognized half the garage. One of the officers finally asked the only question that mattered now. "What exactly did you report?" Melissa opened her mouth, but this time there was no clean script waiting. She could not say dangerous crowd because the crowd was standing there with precinct history written all over it. She could not say disorder because nothing on my driveway or in my garage looked remotely out of control. She could not say she felt threatened without turning every calm face in the garage into a witness against her exaggeration. So she did what people like her always do when confidence runs out. She reached for principle. She said homeowners had a right to peace and that the HOA could not allow gatherings to get out of hand. She said the neighborhood had standards. She said the gathering had become inappropriate for a residential street. The officer on the left looked around again. At the clean curb. At the open garage. At the paper plates. At the men who had all somehow managed to look less threatening than Melissa did while she was talking. Then he asked, what exactly got out of hand? That question just sat there. No one saved her from it. Not me. Not the neighbors. Not even the other officer, who by then looked like he was trying very hard not to smile. Inside the garage, the retired lieutenant leaned back against the workbench and took a sip from his cup like he had all the time in the world. Harris, the man the whole party was for, was standing near the back wall with that tired half-smile still on his face. Watching Melissa the way old cops watch people who have created their own problem and are only now realizing how public it has become. Melissa finally said the music was disruptive. The officer glanced toward the speaker. Low. Barely above conversation. Then he looked at the guests again. He said, this isn't a disturbance. He did not say it harshly. That made it worse. Because a harsh correction can still sound like a disagreement. This did not. This sounded final. Calm. Almost bored. The kind of answer that tells everyone watching the matter was never real enough to deserve the call in the first place. That should have been enough to end it. A calm correction. 2 officers. A quiet street. A garage full of people who had done absolutely nothing to justify the scene Melissa tried to create. Any normal person would have taken the exit right there. Mumbled something about misunderstanding the noise, nodded stiffly, and gone home before the humiliation settled any deeper. Melissa was not normal. She stood there in my driveway with half the block watching and did the one thing that made the whole night worse for her. She argued. Not well. Not clearly. Just desperately. She said the officers did not understand the history. She said this was not an isolated event. She said I had been pushing boundaries for months and the HOA was tired of pretending everything was fine just because I knew people in law enforcement. That line made the garage shift a little. Not loudly. Just enough to tell me the men inside had finally stopped treating her like a nuisance and started treating her like a person digging her own hole deeper in real time. One of the officers asked, what history? Melissa started talking fast then. Too fast. She brought up cars parked on the curb. My garage door being open on weekends. Friends visiting. Music after dark. She stacked petty complaints on top of each other like enough small irritations might somehow add up to an emergency call that made sense. But hearing them out loud in front of actual officers only made the whole thing sound smaller. Sadder. More personal. She was not describing danger. She was describing resentment. And once that became obvious, the neighbors started shifting too. The man across the street who had been watching from his mailbox lowered his arms. A woman near the sidewalk looked away like she suddenly regretted staying for the show. Even people who loved gossip know the exact moment it stops feeling fun and starts feeling ugly. The officer on the right finally said what everyone there had already figured out. This sounds like an HOA complaint, not a police issue. That landed like a door shutting. Because now the uniform was no longer even pretending Melissa had brought them something real. Whatever power she thought she borrowed by calling them was gone. All that remained was her standing in the driveway with her own words still hanging in the air, exposed for what they were. Not concern. Not caution. Not neighborhood safety. Control. Melissa heard that word even if the officer never said it out loud. Control. It was written all over the silence that followed. The kind of silence that only shows up when everyone in the same space suddenly understands the real argument at the same time. This was never about noise. Never about safety. Never about some poor neighborhood struggling to survive a dangerous garage party. It was about a woman who had spent too long using the HOA like a personal weapon and had finally tried it on the wrong night, in front of the wrong people. One of the officers glanced toward the neighbors still watching from driveways and sidewalks, then back at Melissa. He said, calm as ever, if you have an HOA rules issue, that goes through HOA process. Not through us. That was the cleanest cut of the whole night. Because it did not just shut down the complaint. It stripped away the only thing Melissa had left to stand on. The moment police say this is not a police matter, the performance dies. The drama loses its lights. All that remains is the person who made the call and the reason they made it. Melissa tried to say the HOA had already tried to handle things internally. The officer asked if there had been a written notice. She hesitated. Then said something vague about repeated concerns. He asked if any immediate threat, violence, trespass, or disorder existed right now. No, she said. That answer landed harder than anything else she had said. Because once she admitted it herself, right there in front of my driveway, in front of the neighbors, in front of the men inside the garage who had spent careers dealing with real emergencies. The whole thing officially became what it had always been. A bad call. The officer on the left gave me a brief nod, then looked back at the garage and smiled faintly when Harris lifted a paper plate in greeting. Another one of the guests called out, "You boys want a burger before you go," and that got the first real laugh out of one of the responding officers. Melissa did not laugh. She looked like she wanted the pavement to open under her shoes. Because now the same squad car she thought would help her shut down the night were standing in front of a garage full of people who did not fear them, did not need to impress them, and did not fit the story she had sold over the phone. And every second that passed made that contrast sharper. The officers started turning back toward their cars. That was when Melissa realized the worst part was not that they were leaving. It was that they were leaving me exactly where I was. The officers were halfway back to their cars when Melissa made her last mistake. She called after them. Not loudly at first. Just enough to stop one of them from reaching the driver's door. Then, when he turned, she raised her voice and asked if they were seriously going to leave without doing anything. She said the neighborhood deserved better. She said people should not be allowed to hold events like this without consequences. She said if the police were not going to act, then she would make sure the HOA did. That line carried farther than she meant it to. Straight into the garage. Straight across the street. Straight into the ears of neighbors who had already watched her call in a fake crisis and fail. The officer turned back toward her slowly and said the one thing she should have heard an hour earlier from herself. Stop escalating this. That did it. Not because he was harsh. Because he was done. Melissa stood there in my driveway with her phone still in her hand, staring at him like the script had somehow betrayed her. She had built this whole moment around one assumption. If she brought in the badge would side with her. If she created enough public pressure, someone else would finish the job. Instead, the only people looking smaller by the minute were her and the complaint she had dressed up as an emergency. Inside the garage, the men had relaxed again, but now the mood was different. Not tense. Not quiet in that waiting way. Just settled. Certain. Harris was back by the table with his plate. The retired lieutenant had started talking again. Someone near the grill flipped open a cooler lid. The party had resumed before Melissa had even found a way to leave with dignity. That was the part that hurt her most. Not that she was wrong. That nobody needed her version of the night anymore. One of the neighbors by the sidewalk turned and headed back toward her house without even trying to hide the fact that she had lost interest. Another gave me a small nod on his way inside. The block had already started doing what neighborhoods always do when a bully fails in public. It adjusted. Quietly. Permanently. And standing there at the edge of my driveway, with the officers pulling away, the burger still hot, and half the precinct already back to telling old stories in my garage. Melissa was left holding the one thing people like her never know what to do with once they lose it in front of witnesses. Nothing. Melissa stayed in the driveway for a few seconds after the patrol cars pulled away, and those few seconds probably felt longer to her than the whole rest of the night. Because there was nothing left to hide behind now. No officers standing nearby. No threat of shutdown. No illusion that the street had turned against me. Just her, the open garage, the low music, and a neighborhood that had watched the whole thing flip in the worst possible direction for her. That was when the humiliation really settled in. Not all at once. In pieces. First, when nobody followed her lead. Then when the neighbors stopped watching with curiosity and started looking away with that quiet second-hand embarrassment people feel when they have seen somebody push too hard and lose. Then when the garage behind me went fully back to normal. That part mattered most. One of the guys inside started laughing again. Somebody near the cooler asked who wanted another drink. Harris was back by the folding table with a paper plate in one hand and that tired half-smile on his face. The retirement party Melissa had tried to turn into a public safety crisis had already recovered without her. The night had absorbed her performance and moved on. She had not stopped the party. She had just interrupted it. And now even that interruption was ending without leaving her anything useful. Melissa looked at me like she wanted one final argument. One sharp sentence. Something she could carry home and turn into a cleaner story later. But I did not give her one. I just stood there in my driveway and let the silence do what it was already doing better than I ever could. Behind her, one of the neighbors across the street pulled his garage door down halfway. Another went inside. A woman near the sidewalk shook her head once and kept walking. Tiny things. But in neighborhoods like that, tiny things are how reputations move. Melissa had spent years building hers through pressure, posture, and public scenes. She made people feel watched. Corrected. Managed. That kind of power only works while people still believe the scene will end the way you promise it will. Tonight it had not. Tonight the flashing lights showed up, looked around, recognized half the guests, and quietly told her the problem was never real. That kind of failure sticks. Not because people gossip loudly. Because they remember clearly. Melissa finally turned toward the street, phone still in her hand, and started walking back to her house without another word. No stiff farewell. No final HOA warning. No speech about standards or neighborhood peace. Just the fast, angry walk of someone who had shown the whole block exactly how far her authority really reached when it ran into people who were not afraid of it. And inside my garage, as the laughter started rising again and the smell of barbecue drifted back out into the evening air, the story she meant to create was already gone. By the time the night wound down, the whole block felt different. Not louder. Not wilder. Just clearer. The garage was still open. The coolers were half empty. A few folding chairs had been pushed back against the wall. The music stayed low. Harris was sitting near the workbench with two old friends, smiling in that quiet, tired way men smile when the part they will remember later was never the speeches or the food. But the strange little chaos in the middle that proved exactly who was worth having around. The patrol cars were gone. Melissa was gone too. But what she left behind was bigger than a failed complaint. She left behind a new version of herself in the eyes of every person who watched it happen. Not the woman who kept standards. Not the neighbor who protected the block. Not the voice of the HOA. Just a woman who called the cops on a calm garage party, stood there while the officers recognized half the guests. And learned in public that pressure only works when the people on the other side actually fear it. That was the part that would stay. Not because anyone needed to spread it with dramatic retellings. Because neighborhoods remember humiliation in small, quiet ways. A shorter hello. A closed door. A look that lingers 1 second too long. The next morning, people would still wave from driveways. They would still pull trash bins to the curb. They would still walk dogs and check mail and pretend life on the block moved the same way it always had. But Melissa would know. Every time she stepped outside, she would know exactly how many of them had watched the badge fail her. And inside my garage, as the last few men grabbed leftovers and old stories stretched longer than the hour, the whole thing had already become a joke in the only way that mattered. Not cruel. Just settled. One of the retired detectives shook his head on the way out and said she really called the whole precinct to a retirement party. That got the final laugh of the night. I stood at the edge of the driveway after the last truck pulled away, looked out at the quiet street, and realized the funniest part of all was how simple the truth had been from the start. She called the cops on my garage party. 10 minutes later, she met the entire precinct.